The French and Indian War is incredibly important. Without it, I can't imagine how the American Revolution would have happened, at least when it happened. It would have been a totally different history surrounding the independence of the United States had it not been for the French and Indian War. Now, this war actually lasted 9 years, but 2 years into it, in 1756, the nations declared war on each other, and then the official war lasted 7 years, hence giving it its worldwide name, the Seven Years' War. And it was really the first, what amounted to a world war, although it's not called that. Uh, Now, let's focus on the North American component of the Seven Years' War, and the North American War is known as the French and Indian War. Uh, Before the war, uh, it looks like New France was a much more powerful colony than the British colonies in North America. But this map is misleading because the population of French people in New France was only about 76,000, which was a small fraction of the English population of well over 1 million. So this is one significant advantage that the English had. Now, the war began over territory right in this area in the Ohio River Valley. The Ohio River begins in present-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the three rivers that join in downtown Pittsburgh. That would be the Allegheny and the Monongahela, joining to form the Ohio River, and then the Ohio River flows all the way down to the Mississippi. It's also known as an extremely fertile area. The Ohio River Valley is extremely valuable farmland. Now let's look at some key milestones in this war. In 1749, the colony of Virginia gave 500,000 acres of land to a private company called the Ohio Company, in the hope that they would develop this area and build the colony of Virginia. There were also a lot of examples of Virginia legislators with financial interests in the Ohio Company, so corruption was definitely part of the mix here. Virginia didn't have a fully defined western border, so some Virginians thought that their land would extend all the way to the Pacific. But so they felt free to, command or to claim a lot of land in the Ohio River Valley, which is west of current Virginia. The fighting began 5 years after that in 1754, when the French built a fort at Fort Duquesne, which is in present-day Pittsburgh. 2 years later, as I said, Britain and France declared war on each other, resulting in what was later known as the Seven Years' War. Now, the key battle of the war happened in 1759, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, or the Battle of Quebec. This really determined the fate of the continent. The British under Wolfe defeated the French under Montcalm in this battle. And after that, the French really had no reasonable hope of maintaining their foothold in that large area of North America. The following year, they were defeated at Montreal, which is farther up the St. Lawrence River from Quebec. And later that year, they surrendered this outpost, this small settlement called Detroit, in November of 1760. And at the end of 1760, the French were completely out of North America, except for a couple of very small islands near the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. The war officially came to an end in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. There were two treaties of Paris. at 20 years apart. This is the first one. The second one would end the American Revolution. Now let's look at this from the perspective of maps. In this upper map, upper left, as of 1700, you see the large green area here is New France. Now, in 1763, this is the dramatically different map after the end of the Seven Years' War. Britain gets all the land up to the Mississippi River, and Spain is able to negotiate the land west of the Mississippi. But you'll notice in this earlier map, present-day Florida is Spanish territory, and here it is given to the British in compensation for this land that the Spanish got west of the Mississippi. That would change a couple of other times later in history. In 1783, now this is the end of the American Revolution, and this pink area is the territory of the new nation, the United States. And in this treaty, Florida goes back to Spain. But then shortly before 1803, or before the Louisiana Purchase, France got Louisiana back from Spain, and the large area in pink here was the purchase of the land known as Louisiana, which goes all the way up to the current Canadian border, from France to the United States for the sum of $15 million. Okay, this is extending beyond the scope of our time period now, but this is just to give you an overview of how dramatically the map of North America changed over a little over a century. Now, the French and Indian War had major effects on both Native Americans and on Europeans. France had given away all of Native Americans' land to the British, and Native Americans were quite unhappy about that. Their reaction was, how can you give away land that is not yours in the first place? It's ours, not yours. They also were very, very afraid of what it would be like to live under the British. They had decent relations with the French, but the British were another story. And matters were made worse by the disastrous policies of Jeffrey Amherst. In fact, in response to that, Chief Pontiac led a revolt influenced by the Native American philosopher Neolin. Neolin looked at the history of the interactions of the Europeans with Native Americans, and he said they have been nothing but trouble. So he said, we need to cut our ties with Europeans. We need to go back to our old ways of doing things, to our mode of dress, to our mode of technology, to our way of life. We need to forget any attempt to learn European languages or to cooperate or trade with Europeans. We need to abandon all that. And Pontiac was the military commander who attempted to put Neolin's philosophy into action. We should also mention that this was a major change in Pennsylvania. Under William Penn, who founded the colony in 1681, there were very good relations between Native Americans and the Quakers. Quakers were pacifists. They paid fairly for the land of Native Americans. Sometimes they even paid double if two different groups claimed the same land. But the Native Americans in that area of western Pennsylvania sided with the French, and these English settlers who were pushing westward clashed with them and took control of Pennsylvania, and that was the end of Quaker rule in that colony, later state. Now, the 7 Years' War, or French and Indian War, also had major effects among Europeans in North America. First of all, France was completely expelled from the continent, and Britain now became the leading world power. But Their economy was strained badly by the war effort. They spent a lot of money and they went badly into debt. Now they tried to recover some of the war's costs by taxing their colonies, namely the future United States. These colonies were not taxed nearly as much as people in Britain were being taxed, but the increase was still, a big issue for them. Now the French, for their part, are extremely anxious for revenge. France is a proud country, and they were humiliated at the outcome of the 7 Years' War. And of course, they would later help the Americans in the American Revolution and play a decisive role in that. For the Americans' part, they gained a lot of valuable military experience in fighting this war. The best example of that is none other than George Washington, who was a British commander during the war. Now, Native Americans were extremely hostile to the British, the majority of them, the Iroquois being a partial exception to that, and they went to war against the British. So let's talk about the relations that Native Americans had with the British. The British had followed the French custom and given gifts to Indians. They had paid high prices for furs to try to get in the good graces of the Indians, to gain friends and allies from them. But that comes to an end under Jeffrey Amherst, who wants to save money, and the result was very poor relations. Amherst forbade gifts to Indians in that attempt to reduce expenses. Trading was allowed only at British forts, and alcohol was cut off completely, cold turkey. The British provided shoddy goods at high prices to Native Americans. So they had a terrible relationship with them. This is Jeffrey Amherst. There is a town in Ontario, Amherstburg, which is named after him, right down to the present day. But there were other reasons as well for extremely poor relations between the British and Native Americans in this part of the continent. The soldiers' attitude was haughty and arrogant. English traders often provided, poor quality goods. They laced alcohol with opium, which made it more addictive. There were more and more British settlers moving into Indian lands from the east. And to make matters worse, this is not on the screen here, but Amherst actually wrote a letter, and we have the letter, proposing that blankets contaminated with smallpox be distributed to the Indians. This was an early form of what you could call biological warfare. It was at least attempted genocide, about the worst crime that a human being can commit. So Amherst is most definitely a villain in this whole period in history. The Indians under Pontiac had some hope that the French would rescue them and fight back, but that was shattered with the Treaty of Paris. So this brings us to the most successful Indian uprising in American history, and that would be the war led by Chief Pontiac in 1763. The Native Americans captured all of the British forts west of the Alleghenies, the Appalachian Mountains, except for Detroit, Niagara, and Fort Pitt, and they managed to lay siege to Detroit in the process, although the fort never fell. And as I've said, the war only lost steam when the French completely gave up and, allowed Britain to claim all of that territory all the way up to the Mississippi River. There is an important Detroit connection to this. There was a battle fought in what is now Elmwood Cemetery at what was called Parents Creek, which took on the name Bloody Run, and this was a victory by Pontiac's forces. Now, the consequences of the French and Indian War will play out in lots of ways, which we will examine when we look at the American Revolution.